Hey folks, and welcome. Yeah, that thumbnail is correct. I was in a key with one of Echo's warlocks, the wonderful Xerwo. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. I'm absolutely atrocious at things like that. But let's get into the video, the analysis, and kind of the breakdown of how the key went, because although it wasn't competitive, it certainly felt it on my end. So let's get into it. So, starting with the build then, we're both playing Destruction, although there are some variants between the two specs, and we will pull up those variants to compare at the end. But my particular build is a variant of the Necrolord Burn to Ashes build, as you can see. We took our Blasphemy Infernal, 2 points in Burn of Ashes, and down a Blasphemy. Now, I'm running Diabolic Embers here for the extra Incinerates, with both Infernal and Fire and Brimstone. I don't have Channel Demon Fire. I'm running Mayhem over Havoc just to let it passively cleave, and I'm using the legendary Odir Shawl of the Yamara, which is the Havoc increases the damage the target takes, which, as we go through the video, we'll kind of discuss the benefits of using it with and without Mayhem, and Pandemonium just to increase the duration of Havoc. So let's press play and see how this pans out. So first thing to say is on a alt that has to be forementioned, because he's gearing another warlock up, but still. So I have his permission to post this, and yeah. Now it is only a 15, so it's not huge. Again, kind of just moving things around mid-key, because I realised I didn't have Burning Rush actually bound, because we're in this position at the moment where if you're playing Nightfare, you still have Soul Shape. So Soul Shape has been my Shift F keybind throughout the entirety of Shadowlands, and having to move it around so I still have my Shift F as a movement speed is something that I lacked. Now, one thing to say between all these videos is you will see my UI change. Part of this pre-patch is working out a good UI. Now, this first pack was kind of an interesting one, because with the Burn to Ashes build that I'm playing, I'm primarily focusing on using Rain of Fire as my shard spender. So I end up in this situation where I don't actually get to immolate as much, or as much as I should be immolating, if only because I physically am generating so many shards, especially between Inferno and Diabolic Embers. But you can see that does kind of actually play to our advantage a little bit when it comes to later stages of the dungeon. It does mean that I don't necessarily have the levels of burst Zoo does at the start of dungeons or start of packs, because he's running a slightly different build. Now, when we do get on to discussing the variants in his build at the end of the video, I will actually show you what happens if I take his build into another 15 Kara. So we also have that to look forward to in the coming days. But yeah, so there's not too much to say for these early packs. Everyone fairly knows them, they're straightforward. But from a awareness and rotation perspective, we are looking at making sure that we have our Rain of Fire down as much as possible for pyrogenics. We're looking at maintaining the Burn to Ashes buff so that our Incinerates cleave and do damage, and then we're just trying to play around maintaining Roaring Blaze as well, because we are talented into that. So I don't necessarily have the bursty damage that my counterpart does for this, but you will see on the single target fights or the boss fights, I actually kind of maintain a little bit better than I am currently, because I am getting my ass whooped. You know, a couple of K and he's playing an ult and I'm playing my main. This is kind of embarrassing. And I'm losing to a tank as well. It can't be helped. I do apologise for that burst of music. So you can see that Mayhem has applied itself to Lumiore. Not ideal, and this is one of those situations where on a boss fight, realistically, having Havoc normally would be better, because it was just pad damage essentially that I put into Lumiore. And I can't stop that with Havoc, because you can see that Cauldron also has it, which means that these Havoc windows are just being wasted flat out. Alternatively though, Mayhem holds its own in AoE packs. Because it can rapidly reapply itself, we end up in a situation where during the kind of trash packs and going from pack to pack, I'm able to have Havoc up more frequently than Xerwo is. Which, you know, peaks and troughs, but it does mean that in single target encounters I'm kind of struggling a little bit, because I don't have the added damage of Havoc. Now, at this point in the fight, Mayhem actually can get some use, because it helps me kill the ads faster. Now, if I was to thoroughly maximize this, what I should do at this point, or should have done, is actually target off Coggleston, so that he is likely to become my Havoc target, and because I'm also running Duplicitous Havoc as a conduit, that further feeds into this ability to basically focus something else, but still technically do more damage to my main target that is now the Havoc target. Now, thankfully I was able to pull my DPS out there, and have kind of made it so that my overall is now higher. This, for those of you that don't know or don't really do Lower Kara, this is a deliberate death. We're just pulling and we are dying. Not that anyone was really talked about it. As you can see, we kind of just went into starting to do DPS with Xer doing a lot more burst damage. But that's because he has a few choice different talents than I do. And this kind of leads back to what I was discussing in the previous video, both in the State of Warlock and the Destruction Guide video itself. There's a lot of different ways you can play Destruction now. To its benefit or to its detriment is entirely up to you guys. But you will see that we have, if we were to look at this from a raid log perspective, or if I was to pull up the damage pattern had I been logging it, you'd see that we have two very different damage profiles and how that fits into the dungeon, despite the fact we're playing the same spec and we have very similar talents. Like you can see here, the Xerwo is bursting for 110k. This is like his big burst moment at the moment, because he has Infernal and I don't. Like that is one key difference. So he has a 3-minute burst window that I just don't have. I've not talented into it. I am relying on my Blasphemy Infernals to pull me through, which is why you can see that my Blasphemy Infernals are so big. My Blasphemy Infernals are much taller than they should be. And that's because I just physically don't have an Infernal to match with them. So they kind of quote-unquote take priority. But the flip side is, we end up in a situation where, as we discussed with Burning Ashes in the previous videos, I can constantly put out pressure, especially with cycling this Rain of Fire thing. Which means that I don't care as much as what's pulled. It's not a situation where, you know, if you were to have to pop your Infernal, all of a sudden, rather than having a pack of 10, 20 mobs to murder, you actually only have 3 because the tank decided to chicken out. Now, you can see there that I highlighted both of our damage profiles. And this was because our healer in the group, Riptide, was commenting on Incinerate being our highest damaging ability and was wondering what the hell was going on. So, not that much to say, really, on that, just kind of highlighting over it, because Incinerate is doing like 40% of my damage currently. And Chaos Bolt doesn't even come close. Obviously, I'm trying to use Rain of Fire as the main spender, because you can see that I'm applying the fire damage taken debuff to the targets, which makes this considerably easier. And you can see that I've swapped to Droga, and Droga has forced Morose to be the Havoc target, which is good as I just play into my rotation. Making sure that I keep up my Marilith buff for the mastery, and this time Berrybook has the Havoc, which is nice, and we just go through. I do kind of play a couple of Chaos Bolts. This part, personally, is really bad. I should have spent some shards, whether it be a Rain of Fire or a Chaos Bolt, but I was at 5 shards for quite a while because I was focusing on getting the Incinerates out. Because at this point in time, my Incinerates are hitting harder than my Chaos Bolts, which is a poor rotational choice on my end, but at this stage, arguably, might have been the right choice. I don't really know. Personally, it probably wasn't. Looking back on it, I should have at least Rain of Fire because it's instant cast. So you can see there that I've got like 23k Chaos Bolts and my Incinerator doing like 25k. Which is ridiculous. It's almost like shards are irrelevant at this point for single target, and all I care about is maintaining my Burn to Ashes buff. So Chaos Ball comes in, I get 2 stacks of the Burn to Ashes buff up here, and I need to just maintain that. Now, what I should have done there, just as the death of Morose, is I should have Decimating Bolted. Because obviously Decimating Bolt and Shard of Annihilation will take us into the next pack. Because we have a quite aggressive Prot Warrior tank, which is nice, and we end up in a situation like this. So you can see that I've already applied a Havoc, and that was just for a fast Conflagurate, and we kind of go into it. Now, this is where we start getting into a situation where I don't really have time to incinerate anything, because I don't need to. Like, don't get me wrong, it does a nice enough amount of damage, but I am constantly pumping out shards. Unfortunately, I get myself Earthquaked and Firelocked, which doesn't really help, but as you can see, my damage was high enough that we were still doing okay. And our Blasphemy Infernals making use of the Infernal Brand Conduit, which, when I think about it like that, if my Blasphemy Infernals are going to have the Infernal Brand Conduit as well, then I should definitely be running Cataclysm. Because Cataclysm, being able to mass apply Immolate at the start of fights rather than relying on Rain of Fire to generate its own soul shards, would be considerably more beneficial. Because you've got to remember, putting a Rain of Fire down as well after that Cataclysm will just increase the damage everything takes from Immolate. So there's a few things to nuance. Again, kind of noticing that my weak aura, I really should be on top of flesh crafting. But as someone that has been predominantly a Night Fae for the majority of Shadowlands, I'm not very good at having to juggle fleshcraft every 2 minutes. But you can see that here we're pretty evenly matched, even though we have 2 different builds, essentially. And one of us may have used cooldowns while the other didn't have any to use in the first place. A fleshcraft there, which is nice. Now, something that I learned in the replay of this, when I took Xerwo's build and applied it to myself, Fleshcraft will stop some forms of CC, like Maiden of Virtue's Mass Repentance, which I didn't realise. Completely accidental usage, but I immuned it by channeling Fleshcraft while having Plague the Visor Marilith as my Soulbind. So, that was nice. But yeah, you can see that I'm in a situation where I'm really not getting out a lot of Immolates, which is probably bad, but as I say, I just don't need the shard generation from it. Not with this particular build anyway. Now, I will be honest, at this point, this is where I start realizing that I'm just being humbled at this point, and it was an appropriate lesson, and it's the fact that I forget to use curses. I very rarely apply curses nowadays, unless it's Curse of Exhaustion. And seeing Curse of Weakness being applied made me think, yeah, should have done something about that. Now, this is really bad positioning on my part, because I am about to be put to sleep by that moving pool, but instead I am focusing on trying to actually do damn. So, there we go, I get put to sleep for it. Because I'm an nincompoop and wasn't paying attention to my surroundings. Thankfully, the Red Paladin of the guild, Ned, did a fantastic job of repping the guild and did some damage there, but as you can see, the overall, it's tighter than it should be, and it's tighter than I'd like. I'm being beaten by a Red Paladin at this point, which, you know, isn't good, and is right behind my ass, with less than 200 DPS in it. So you can see Fire and Brimstone coming in. We're both running Fire and Brimstone. And thankfully, we both have, I have green fire and he has red, which is quite nice, and you can kind of see the difference. But you can see how we're both playing. And the difference between the two of us at this point, bearing in mind that Infernal hasn't been popped and he's not using its cooldowns, some of this will be down to gear, as we'll discuss at the end. But because I'm running Diabolic Embers, I'm generating more shards, which means more Rain of Fires. And I'm just able to stack out more as a fight progresses. So for these longer sustained fights, I have a little bit more staying power, but for the shorter fights, I'm going to lose. And that can't really be helped, unfortunately. At least not yet. Obviously, going into Dragonflight, we won't have Legendary and we won't have the Necrolord ability, but that won't stop the fact that Burn to Ashes is actually a really good build if you just want sustained pumping power. It does mean that you've got a few decisions to make, but they're entirely attainable. And you can see here that this is where things get interesting. Because I've kind of pre-prepped going into this pack, so I was able to make full use of my AoE. And because I don't have cooldowns in the traditional sense, I don't have to worry about holding anything, whereas Xer does. Like, Xer is probably holding an Infernal for the boss to be able to put out more damage. You can kind of see that we've just passively dealt with it. Now, this is a bad part on my stage. I realized that I wasn't actually using my trinket at all. Because I had the wrong trinket equipped on my bar. Which kind of sucks. And puts us in this really odd position. Now, that... Midnight's immune to damage, but I was able to force Havoc to be applied to Huntsman and then swapped to Huntsman to deal damage. Some might argue it was a fluke. I'm going to sit and say that it was intended. But you can see that the flip side of that is because I'm now focusing Huntsman, Midnight got the Havoc buff and I can't do anything with that. I can now, but the problem with Mayhem is the fact that it applies a shorter Havoc, which unfortunately means that I couldn't actually benefit from it. And this is one of those paramount fights where having Havoc be controllable would probably have been considerably better. Now, positioning's a little bit off here. You see that I end up getting juggled a little bit. Somehow survived that with a cookie and just kind of living through it, because warlocks be bullshit. But every right I should have died there. So that was a positional problem on my end. Now, again, we end up in another situation where Huntsman gets Havoc for a short period of time, which is nice, and an extra little bit of damage. I unending resolve at this point because I just wanted to do... Apologies. I just wanted to do damage and try and push the window. Probably should have just held unending resolve, really. But... all in all, not too shabby. I could have probably pumped out a little bit more DPS and maybe got myself into the 20k mark had I played more efficiently. But finishing this fight, 16, 17k, not too shabby. Again, should be a little bit better on the unending or the flesh crafting. Maybe make that weak aura a little bit bigger or put a timer on the weak aura if I can. Now, making full use of Burning Rush. And this is where the route deviates slightly. Most groups, as you can see, some of us were going up that ramp. The tank instead decides to take us under, which is interesting. And due to the way that we've pulled numbers-wise, this is actually going to work out quite well for us. But you skip the entire ballroom, which is quite big, really. Especially given how problematic it can be. Because these arachnids and these widows and stuff, they just do a route. That's it. That's all they do, really. Which means that for having 2 ranged DPS, a ranged healer, a warrior and a red paladin, we're not particularly fussed about what they can put out in front of them. And speaking of red paladins, our red paladin decides that no, that's his pack and he wants it. So they kind of get deleted. Again, kind of just checking up my talents, because I wanted to make sure that I, wasn't deceiving myself. Because we'd kind of got through this, and at the moment I was kind of riding a bit of a silly high, as it were, because I got notifications from YouTube and stuff about being accepted to the partner program, and was worried, or had kind of forgotten that I showed the talents at the start of the video. So flashed them up, and if I needed to, I could talk about them there rather than later. Don't try and multitask, kids. It's never a good idea. Now, one thing I will say is not having a tank to communicate with and not knowing pulls can be a little bit problematic for this build, especially if you're relying on your decimating bolts to be able to move into doing damage for a boss. Like if you want to clip the back end of a pack with it, hold your incinerate casts, and then make use of it going forward into Maiden of Virtue. So you've kind of got to guess. Thankfully though, Decimating Bolt has a short enough cooldown that you're not too punished for it otherwise. But again, this goes back into that whole destruction and pulling and kind of knowing what your tank's doing and builds being caught out. So although we're very flexible, we can get caught out. Now, Maiden of Virtue, I've got my Decimating Bolt up, a Havoc window goes out on a sentry, and we just go to town. I should have Rain of Fired again, another observation rather than Chaos Bolting, but still. Because Rain of Fire would have obviously improved the damage of my Immolate. Incinerate. Speaking of which though, Virtue should have a Immolate on her much sooner than she did. So that is problematic on my part. We have another Decimating Bolt. Should really Rain of Fire prior going into this. Maintain Roaring Blaze. And get these Incinerates out. We get the debuff. So we get Repented and immediately broken out of it, which is what we want. Rapid Fire Chaos Bolt to get our Burn to Ashes stacks back up. And then we just go into it. Now, on pure single target like this, using Chaos Bolt is probably the better shout due to Eradication. But at the same time, because I'm using a build where Rain of Fire is more likely to be my spender, we should have probably looked at moving away from Eradication if I'm not planning on casting so many Chaos Bolts. Now, this is Xer's character. I had 30 item levels on him, and it was at this point where I really realised just how humbled I'd been. I knew he was an old, but as you can see in this bottom corner, if I just hit play and remove it, you can see that I ended up on 27.8k, where Xer was on 25.1. Now, this is the build he's running. So, key differences. He's not running Roaring Blaze, and he's not running Explosive Potential, though the conflagration reduction, because he's not juggling Roaring Blaze, so he doesn't need to. He's instead running Channel Demon Fire. Now, why is that important? Well, Channel Demon Fire obviously splash damages and hits everything that's a target afflicted by your Immolate. Now, he's also running Cataclysm rather than Inferno. And this means that at the start of packs, he's able to do that Cataclysm, Rain of Fire, Channel Demon Fire, and essentially detonate on packs early on while still benefiting from Fire and Brimstone, Burn to Ashes, and being able to do that AoE damage. The other flip side is he also has his Infernal, which means he does have moments where he can mass generate shards on a 3-minute cooldown. He doesn't have as many shards as I do, though, to play with consistently because he doesn't have embers. So both builds work, and as you can see, both builds are capable of doing 25k plus DPS, especially given the fact he did it at 270 item level. But that's kind of one of the things I wanted to demonstrate in this video, and I'll also demonstrate it in the other destruction videos that will be coming, in that flexibility is decent, but you still have a similar playstyle. So yeah, that kind of brings us to the end of this video. I went up against one of Echo's warlocks, sort of held my own, sort of, but equally got humbled at the same time. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed this, and I will see you all in the next one, where we will actually go over the warlock dungeons I did that pertain to this morning's video of the state of warlocks. Until then, hope you all have a wonderful night, and I'll catch you all later.